The grand mansion stood silent in the middle of the night, its tall windows glowing faintly under the moonlight. Inside, the hallways were decorated with priceless paintings, marble floors, and golden lamps, but the silence carried something. More than peace, it carried loneliness. The master of the house, a powerful billionaire, was used to silence. He worked late hours, held meetings in different cities, and left his home empty except for his infant child, and the few people hired to take care of him. The child's mother had been gone for months, leaving behind questions no one dared to ask. The billionaire poured his energy into building empires, while his child grew up in the hands of strangers. But among those strangers was one maid who cared for the baby as if it was her own. She was young, quiet, and unnoticed most of the time. She was not dressed in jewels or fine clothes. She wore the plain uniform of her duty. Yet her eyes carried warmth that the mansion never had. On one particular evening, after a long day filled with board meetings and endless arguments over money, the billionaire returned home exhausted. He expected the usual scene, his child asleep in the nursery, the staff quietly finishing their chores. But as he stepped into the grand living room, he froze. The sight before him made his heart beat faster in a way business never could. On the carpeted floor, the maid was lying asleep, her head resting gently on her arm. On her back, the baby rested peacefully, tiny hands clutching her uniform as though he had found his safe place in the world. The expensive sofas, the grand curtains, and the shining chandeliers seemed invisible compared to this fragile picture on the floor. For a moment, the billionaire's instinct was anger. His sharp voice echoed before he could stop it. "Back off, my kid." His tone startled even himself. He had always believed distance was protection, that wealth built walls strong enough to shield his child. But then he noticed something he had never allowed himself to see before. The baby's face was calm. No tears, no cries, just peace. And it was not the mansion, not the wealth, not even his father's presence that gave the child this peace. It was the maid, the billionaire's. Anger melted almost instantly, replaced by something heavier: guilt. He had given his son everything money could buy. But here was the truth, lying on the floor. His baby did not need riches. He needed love, comfort, and warmth. The billionaire's chest tightened as he realized how absent he had been, how much of his child's life had been held by the hands of someone he barely noticed. Slowly, he stepped closer. His shoes made no sound on the thick carpet. He crouched near them, his eyes moving between the sleeping baby and the maid. She looked exhausted, her face showing the weight of sleepless nights spent rocking a child that wasn't hers. She hadn't demanded recognition, nor had she asked for thanks. She had simply given her heart where it was needed. The billionaire swallowed hard. For the first time, he did not see her as just a servant. He saw her as the one person who had been more present for his child than he had. A wave of respect, almost reverence, passed over him. His son's tiny breath rose and fell with hers, as if they shared one heartbeat. The man felt a sting in his eyes, a feeling he was not used to: tears. He blinked them away quickly, afraid to admit his weakness, even to himself. Yet the picture before him told a truth he could no longer deny. All his power, all his fortune, had failed to do what this one maid had done without effort. She had given his child love. He leaned back, his mind racing. Questions tore at him. Why had he not seen this before? How many times had he walked past his child's cries, believing someone else would handle it? How much of his son's life had already slipped through his fingers, while he was busy building towers of glass and steel? The room felt smaller, as though the walls themselves leaned in to demand an answer. The billionaire had faced hostile takeovers, courtroom battles, and investors ready to destroy him, yet nothing had shaken him like this quiet scene. His heart, which had long been locked behind steel doors, cracked open. And for the first time, he understood what true wealth meant. As he stood silently, the baby stirred. shifting slightly on the maid's back. The tiny movement sent a fresh wave of emotion through him. This was not just his child. This was his legacy, his blood, his reason. And here was someone who had protected it better than he had. The billionaire turned his gaze toward the window. The city lights blinked in the distance, symbols of his empire. But for the first time, he wondered if all of it was worth anything if he couldn't protect the small world resting before him on the floor. That night marked the beginning of something he never expected. It was not a business deal, not a political victory, but something far more dangerous and precious. It was the start of his awakening. The next morning, the house staff moved quietly through the mansion, polishing tables, adjusting curtains, and preparing breakfast in the grand kitchen. The maid who had fallen asleep with the baby woke up early, embarrassed that she had been found lying on the floor. She straightened her uniform quickly, worried that the billionaire would dismiss her for being careless. Her first thought was not of herself, but of the child. She checked his blanket, fixed his small bottle, and whispered softly to him as if nothing had happened. What she didn't know was that the billionaire had hardly slept that night. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his enormous bedroom, hearing the silence louder than ever. For years he had believed his fortune protected him from the struggles of ordinary men. He had believed that love could be replaced by luxury, that comfort could be bought with gold. Yet the memory of the maid sleeping on the floor haunted him. Her tired face, the baby's peaceful rest. It was an image more powerful than any deal he had ever made. At breakfast, he entered the dining room sharply dressed, as always, but his eyes carried shadows. The maid served him quietly, avoiding his gaze, but he noticed her trembling hands. He wanted to speak, to tell her he was not angry, but the words felt heavy on his tongue. For a man used to commanding entire companies, speaking kindness felt strangely difficult. He finally broke the silence. "Did you stay there all night?" His voice was softer than he intended. The maid froze, unsure if it was a question or an accusation. "Yes, sir," she whispered. "The baby wouldn't sleep unless I stayed close. I didn't mean to fall asleep myself." The billionaire's fork paused halfway. He looked at her properly for the first time, not as a uniform, not as background staff, but as a person. She was young, younger than he had realized, but her eyes carried years of responsibility. He thought of his own youth, filled with ambition and fire, but none of the warmth she gave so freely. He cleared his throat, trying to hide the lump rising there. "You did well," he said simply. The maid looked up in surprise, her eyes wide. No one in the mansion ever heard praise from him, not even his highest managers. She nodded quickly, lowering her gaze again, but inside her heart calmed. As the day went on, the billionaire found himself distracted during meetings. He sat in his office, surrounded by screens filled with numbers and charts, but his mind kept drifting back to the sight of his child clinging to the maid's back. He wondered when was the last time his son had clung to him like that. The answer struck him hard. Never. In the afternoon, he returned to the nursery quietly, almost as if sneaking into forbidden territory. The maid was there, rocking the baby gently in her arms. She hummed a soft tune, her voice low but steady, and the baby's eyelids drooped with sleep. The billionaire stood in the doorway, unseen, and felt something stir in him. The song was not fancy, not trained, but it was filled with love, for a man who had built walls around his heart. Watching this simple act felt like those walls were cracking. He stepped inside. The maid looked up, startled, and stood quickly, apologizing again for being seen in such a personal moment. But the billionaire raised his hand. "Don't stop," he said quietly. She hesitated, then continued the song, and for the first time in years, the billionaire sat silently in a chair, listening to a lullaby. When the baby finally slept, the maid laid him gently in the crib. She turned to leave, but the billionaire spoke again. How long have you been caring for him like this?" She paused. "Since he was born, sir. You were busy, so I made sure he didn't feel alone." The words pierced him. Busy. That word had defined his life. He had been busy chasing wealth, busy building towers, busy winning battles that never truly mattered. And while he was busy, his son's heart had been shaped by someone else's love. That evening, the billionaire walked into his private study and closed the door. For hours he sat in silence, reflecting on choices he had made. He thought about the empires he controlled, the respect he commanded, the headlines that praised him. None of it mattered compared to the small child in the nursery. None of it mattered compared to the maid who had given what he could not. He stared at a photograph on his desk, his wife, smiling in a moment long gone. She had left because she could not bear the coldness of the mansion, the distance in his soul. He had thought she was weak. Now he wondered if she had only been human, enough to want love. For the first time, he admitted to himself, he was failing as a father. The realization cut deep, sharper than any loss in business. But it also lit a spark inside him. A determination not driven by money, but by something far stronger. He decided that from this day, he would no longer be absent. As he stepped out of the study, he passed the living room where the maid was folding tiny clothes. She looked up briefly, and he nodded at her, not as a master to a servant, but as one guardian of the child to another. She blinked, surprised again, but in that small gesture, she felt something shift. The mansion, for the first time, felt less cold. The next day began with unusual silence in the mansion. Normally, the billionaire would rush out early, surrounded by assistants and phone calls, but today he lingered. He sat at the long breakfast table, untouched food in front of him, his mind still wrapped around the image of his child clinging to the maid. He realized he no longer wanted to rush out into the world of endless deals. Something inside him urged him to stay, to watch, to understand. The maid moved about the dining room, placing fresh juice and cleaning up quietly. She kept her eyes lowered, uncertain of his mood. In her heart, she expected anger, perhaps even dismissal. She knew her place in the house, and it was not to be noticed. Yet when the billionaire finally spoke, his voice was calm. "You've been here a long time?" She nodded carefully. 3 years, sir." He raised an eyebrow. 3 years. That meant she had been there since before the baby was born, long enough to know the mansion's every shadow. He thought about how little he had noticed. He had hired her through an agency, seen her as just another face in the background. But in truth, she had been the constant presence in his son's life, the one who had filled the silence when he had been absent. The baby's laughter suddenly echoed from the hallway. The billionaire stood quickly, drawn by the sound. He found his son sitting on the carpet with a toy, the maid kneeling beside him, encouraging him to stack blocks. The boy's eyes sparkled, his little hands moving clumsily but full of joy. The billionaire watched, struck by how natural it looked. The boy looked safe, looked loved. He crouched down, trying to join. His son looked at him with wide eyes, unsure, as though he was seeing a stranger. The billionaire's chest tightened painfully at that look. He reached for one of the blocks, placing it carefully on the stack. The boy blinked, then giggled softly. It was a small sound, but to the billionaire, it felt like a door opening. The maid watched quietly, her hands pausing for a moment. She had never seen the master of the house lower himself to the floor, never seen him try to play with his child. There was an awkwardness in his movements, but also a deep sincerity. She held her breath, afraid the moment might break. Later that afternoon, the billionaire surprised everyone by canceling his meetings. His secretary called 3 times, reminding him of urgent matters, but he ignored it. He stayed in the mansion, observing his child, watching the maid, realizing how much of life he had missed. When the boy reached out with tiny fingers, he allowed the little hand to grip his own. The feeling was fragile, yet powerful, and it shook him more than any contract ever had. At lunch, he asked the maid to sit at the table with the baby, something she had never done before. She hesitated, looking confused, but he gestured firmly. "Sit," he said. His tone was still strong, but different now, less command, more invitation. She obeyed carefully, feeding the baby while he watched. "You care for him like he's your own," the billionaire said after a long silence. The maid looked down, unsure how to answer. "He needed someone, sir. Children should not grow alone." Her words hit him deeply. He thought of his own childhood, of the cold halls where nannies rotated in and out, where affection was rare. He had promised himself he would never be weak, never waste time on emotions. But now, looking at his son's innocent face, he realized the cycle was repeating. That evening, instead of retreating to his study, he sat in the nursery. The maid placed the baby in his crib, but the child fussed, reaching out as if afraid to be left. The maid leaned over, humming softly again. The billionaire stepped closer, uncertain. "May I try?" he asked, surprising even himself. She looked at him, shocked by the question, but nodded slowly. He leaned down, speaking softly to his son, his voice rough and unpracticed. The baby whimpered at first, then calmed slightly at the sound of his father's words. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. The billionaire felt warmth spread through him, a bond forming where there had been distance. When the baby finally closed his eyes, the billionaire stood quietly, his gaze lingering on the peaceful face. He turned to the maid. "You've done more for him than I ever have," he admitted, the words heavy but honest. The maid shook her head. "No, sir. A child always needs his father most. I only filled the silence." Her humility stunned him. She had given so much, yet she took no credit. He realized then that her strength was not in wealth, but in heart. As the night grew late, the billionaire walked through the mansion halls with a strange feeling in his chest. It was not pride, not ambition. It was something new, something fragile, but stronger than steel. He was beginning to understand what it meant to be a father. And though he didn't know how to express it yet, he knew one thing for certain. He could not go back to the man he was before, for the first time in years. He did not feel alone. The following days in the mansion felt different, though no one could say exactly why. The air seemed lighter, and the silence was no longer so heavy. The billionaire, who once hurried through the halls without a second glance, now paused. He stopped to listen to his child's laughter, stopped to watch the maid move gently around the nursery. It was as if his world had shifted overnight. The staff whispered about the change. They had served him for years, knowing him as a man of steel, unbending and cold. Yet now, they noticed small gestures that surprised them. He asked about his child's meals. He spent more time at home. He even thanked the maid once, his voice soft but genuine. To the staff, it felt as if the mansion itself had come alive. Again. One evening, the billionaire walked into the nursery earlier than usual. The maid was sitting on the floor with the baby on her lap, holding a small toy while teaching him how to grip it. The boy's face lit up with excitement every time she clapped her hands in encouragement. The billionaire stood in the doorway, his chest warming at the sight. For years he had thought joy was something to be earned through success. Now he saw it shining in something as small as a baby's smile. He stepped inside, and the baby looked up at him with curious eyes. The billionaire knelt beside them, reaching for the toy. "Let me try," he said. His voice carried no command, only a quiet request. The maid handed him the toy with careful hands. The baby hesitated, then reached for it, grabbing his father's finger instead. The billionaire froze, overwhelmed by the tiny grip. His son's touch was soft yet firm, as if claiming him at last. The maid watched the moment in silence. She had always known the baby longed for his father, even if he could not put it into words. Now, seeing them connect, she felt relief. But she also felt a strange ache in her chest, a reminder that her role was only temporary. She was the caretaker, not the family. That night, after the baby fell asleep, the billionaire asked her to stay a moment. She looked startled but obeyed, standing quietly as he leaned against the crib. "You've given him something I never could," he said slowly. "Patience, warmth, a home." The maid lowered her gaze. "It is only what every child deserves. Sir, nothing more." He studied her face, noticing the weariness in her eyes, the way she carried responsibility without complaint. "You speak as if it is simple," he said, "but it is not. Not for everyone." His voice faltered, and he surprised himself with his honesty. "Not for me." For the first time she met his eyes. "It can be, sir. Children do not need perfection. They only need presence." Her words struck him harder than any argument. In his business life, presence, a word so simple, yet so powerful. He realized he had spent his whole life building empires to be remembered, while his son would remember only whether he had been there or not. The following morning, he made a decision that shocked his office. He canceled his trip to another country, something he had never done before. His board argued, his partners questioned him, but he ignored them. He stayed home. When asked why, he gave no explanation. But inside he knew the answer. His son needed him more than the world did. The maid noticed the change too. Each day, he spent longer hours in the nursery. He tried to feed the baby, awkwardly at first, spilling more than he managed, but he laughed quietly when the child smeared food on his sleeve. The maid watched, hiding her smile, as the cold billionaire transformed into a father before her eyes. One afternoon, as rain fell softly against the windows, the baby began to cry. The maid moved to comfort him, but the billionaire stepped forward. "Instead, let me," he said. She hesitated, then stepped aside. He picked up his son, holding him close. The child squirmed at first, but then nestled against his chest, quieting slowly. The billionaire closed his eyes, feeling the tiny heartbeat against his own. It was a rhythm that no wealth could ever replace. The maid watched silently, her hands clasped tightly. In that moment, she saw something she had long hoped for, the bond between father and child growing strong. It was beautiful, but it also reminded her of her place. She was not the family. She was the shadow who had carried the weight until the father was ready. Later, when the baby was asleep again, the billionaire spoke once more. "I owe you more than I can ever repay," he said. His voice was low, but filled with conviction. "If not for you, I would have lost him entirely." The maid shook her head, her voice soft. "You owe me nothing, sir. He is yours. I only did what was right." But deep inside, the billionaire knew it was more than that. She had saved his child from loneliness, and perhaps she had saved him as well. As the rain cleared and the evening sun broke through the clouds, the mansion glowed with a warmth it had not known for years. For the first time, the billionaire felt hope. Hope that he could change, hope that he could be the father his son deserved. And in that fragile hope, his heart began to heal. The days passed, and the mansion became a different place altogether. The once cold, echoing halls now carried the sound of laughter, small giggles, and the quiet hum of lullabies. The billionaire, who once moved through the house like a ghost, now walked with purpose, not for business, but for the baby who awaited him with bright eyes and eager hands. The staff continued to whisper about the change. Some said the master had softened, others said he had finally learned what mattered. But all agreed on one thing: it was the maid's quiet presence that had brought this shift. Her patience, her endless care, had created a bridge between the billionaire and his child. One evening, after a long day, the billionaire asked the maid to join him in the living room once the baby was asleep. She stood nervously at the edge of the room, unsure why she was called. He sat near the fireplace, a glass of untouched wine on the table beside him. For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Finally he spoke. "Do you know why I built all this?" He gestured around the luxurious room, the high ceilings, the polished marble, the golden accents. "I thought wealth would protect me. I thought power would fill the emptiness I grew up with, but I was wrong." The maid lowered her gaze. She was not used to hearing such confessions from the man she worked for. He leaned forward, his voice quieter now. "You gave my child something I didn't know how to give. And in doing so, you gave me something I didn't know I needed." Her hands tightened on her apron. "I only did my duty, sir," she said softly. He shook his head. "No, duty does not come with love. Yet you gave him love, freely." His voice faltered, carrying an emotion he rarely allowed. "I will never forget that." The maid swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. She had always believed her work would remain invisible. She had never expected recognition, let alone gratitude. But hearing his words made her heart tremble. The next morning, the billionaire made another surprising choice. He cleared his schedule for the entire week. His business partners were furious. His board demanded explanations, but he refused. For the first time in years, he placed his family above his empire. He spent his mornings feeding his son clumsily, but with growing confidence. He learned how to hold the bottle, how to rock the child when he cried. He even allowed himself to be laughed at when the baby smeared food on his expensive shirt. The maid watched each moment quietly, a small smile hidden on her lips. She knew these were steps toward healing, not just for the child, but for the father as well. One afternoon, the baby took his first shaky steps across the nursery floor. The billionaire was there, kneeling on the carpet, his arms open wide. The boy stumbled, fell, and then stood again, determination on his tiny face. When he finally reached his father, the billionaire lifted him high into the air, his laughter echoing through the room. It was a sound the staff had never heard from him before, pure and unrestrained. The maid felt tears prick her eyes. She had dreamed of this moment for the child, for him to know his father's embrace, to feel loved beyond duty. Now, seeing it with her own eyes, she felt her role slowly fading. The boy no longer clung only to her. He reached for his father too. And that was how it should be. That night when the baby slept peacefully, the billionaire found the maid in the kitchen. Tidying quietly, he stopped in the doorway. "You've given him more than I ever could have alone. I want you to know, I see you. I see what you've done." Her chest tightened at his words, but she bowed her head. "Thank you, sir." He stepped closer, his voice steady. "You are not just staff in this house. You are part of what saved my family." The maid blinked rapidly, fighting tears. For so long, she had lived in the background, her care unnoticed, her sacrifices unspoken. To hear this recognition felt like a weight lifting from her heart. In the following days, the billionaire changed even more. He no longer treated the maid as invisible. He asked for her thoughts on the child's needs, listened when she spoke, and respected her answers. Slowly, a new rhythm formed in the mansion. The three of them, the father, the maid, and the baby, created a fragile but growing bond. And yet, deep inside the maid's heart, a quiet fear remained. She knew her place in the house was never meant to be permanent. One day, the child would grow closer to his father, and her presence would no longer be needed. She reminded herself of that truth each night, even as her heart resisted it. For the billionaire, however, the thought of her leaving felt unbearable. He had begun to realize that her presence was not only vital for his son, but for himself as well. She had given him more than love for the child. She had given him a chance to change, to feel human again. As the sun set one evening, casting golden light across the nursery, the billionaire stood by the crib, watching his son sleep. The maid stood nearby, folding a blanket. He looked at her. his voice low but filled with meaning. "You are not just his caretaker. You are the reason I have him at all." The maid froze, the blanket clutched in her hands. She had no answer. But in her silence he saw everything, the humility, the sacrifice, the love that had never asked for reward. And in that moment, he knew that his life, once built on power and wealth alone, had found its true foundation. The mansion no longer felt like a palace of cold marble and glass. It had become something softer, warmer, almost alive. Every corner carried the sound of gentle laughter, the echo of footsteps that belonged not to workers rushing quietly, but to a child chasing joy. The billionaire had changed, and everyone could see it. But deep inside his own heart, he knew he still had one final step to take. The maid remained humble, as she always had, carrying out her duties quietly. She never demanded more than her position, never crossed the line between servant and master. Yet the billionaire could not ignore the truth any longer. She had given his son more than he had ever known how to give, and in doing so, she had given him a second chance at life. One evening, he entered the nursery and found her sitting on the floor with his son in her lap. She was telling him a simple story, her voice calm, her expression soft. The baby leaned against her chest, fighting sleep with tiny yawns. The billionaire stood there, watching silently. Something tightened in his chest, not pain, but recognition. The baby finally drifted into dreams. The maid laid him carefully in the crib. She turned and froze when she saw the billionaire standing behind her. She lowered her head quickly. "Forgive me, sir, I didn't notice you." He stepped closer. "You've never had to ask forgiveness for loving my son." His voice trembled, though he tried to hold it steady. "You've done more than I ever have. You've given him peace, comfort, and love. And you've shown me what I was too blind to see." The maid kept her gaze lowered. "It is my duty, sir. Nothing more." "No," he said firmly. "It is not duty. It is sacrifice, and sacrifice is born of love." Her breath caught. She didn't know what to say. She had never imagined the master of the house would speak such words to her. For years, she had carried the weight quietly, never seeking recognition. But now, hearing his truth, her eyes burned with tears she tried to hide. The billionaire looked at the crib where his son slept peacefully, then back at her. "I built empires, but they gave me nothing. You gave me my son. You gave me the chance to be a father." The room fell into silence. Only the soft breathing of the child filled the air. Slowly the maid found her voice. "He needs you more than anyone, sir. That is all I ever wanted, to keep him safe until you were ready." The billionaire shook his head. "No, he needs us both. You are not just the maid in this house. You are part of his life, part of his heart." He hesitated, the words heavy, but honest, "and part of mine." Her hands trembled. She had never thought of herself as more than a shadow in the mansion, someone who filled the silence and then would one day be forgotten. But his words were too strong, too clear to ignore. She finally looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw all the years of patience, all the hidden strength. For the first time he smiled, not the cold smile of business, but the warm smile of a man who had finally understood what mattered. "From now on, you are not alone in raising him. We will raise him together." The maid's lips parted, but no words came. Tears slipped down her cheeks silently, not from sorrow but from relief. She had carried the weight so long, and now it was shared. The billionaire stepped closer, his voice softer than it had ever been. "I cannot change the past, but I can choose the future. And I choose this family." The baby stirred in the crib, making a small sound, as if sensing the change in the room. Both of them turned, watching the child settle again. In that moment, it felt as if the mansion itself had breathed a sigh of peace. The next morning, staff noticed something different. The billionaire no longer walked ahead with sharp commands. He carried his child in his arms, the maid walking beside him, her head held higher than before. For once, They looked not like master and servant, but like a family. Rumors spread quickly in the city about the billionaire who had changed. Some laughed, some doubted, but those who saw him with his child knew the truth. Power had not softened him. Love had. And so, the man who once measured his worth by towers of glass and steel, now measured it by the small arms wrapped around his neck, by the laughter that filled his halls, and by the woman who had taught him that presence was worth more than all the gold in the world. His heart had melted. Not because of wealth, not because of power, but because one maid had chosen to sleep on the floor with a baby who was not hers, and in doing so, had shown him what it truly meant to be human. The mansion was no longer just his house. It was their home,